Hello. General Hospital today will revealing Anna had vanished in a way that was so quiet, so precise, that her absence melted seamlessly into the background noise of Port Charles. No alarms were raised. No calls went unanswered. Not even Jason, whose instincts had been honed by years of operating on the razor's edge between danger and survival, noticed the subtle vacuum left by her disappearance. In a city spinning with clandestine agendas, betrayals, and shifting alliances, her silence was mistaken for distance, her absence for retreat. And while the rest of the town turned its gaze toward new rivalries and emergent threats, Anna Devane was enduring a private apocalypse hidden from the world, imprisoned somewhere so remote, so removed from the rhythms of the familiar, that time itself became a distortion. She was being held in a chamber carved out of darkness, a place that felt outside of history, with walls that didn't echo and lights that flickered like dying memories. Days stretched without anchor, nights bled into one another without end, and the cold seeped into her bones until she forgot what warmth even felt like. There was no sound save for her own breathing and, occasionally, the shuffle of a footstep that may or may not have been real. At first, Anna clung to logic. She measured time in heartbeats, reviewed mental timelines, reconstructed faces and names, connections and possibilities. But logic phrased under captivity. The longer she stayed, the more her mind began to betray her. It started with whispers. Not words? Exactly. But impressions like shadows brushing against her consciousness. Then came the visions. First hazy, then vivid. She saw Peter August. Alive. Not just alive, but calm, composed. And watching her, his smirk, the one she thought she'd never see again, burn into her retinas even after she closed her eyes. The hallucinations became frequent and visceral. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he reached for her. Sometimes he turned away, leaving her in terror not from what he might do, but from what she might become if she continued to see a ghost with such conviction. There were moments when she believed her memories had been altered, that her mind was being twisted deliberately. Other times, she feared that no one would come, not because they couldn't, but because she had already been forgotten. Jason wasn't coming. It was as if she had been erased. Elsewhere in Port Charles, Nathan West was wrestling with his own haunting dissonance. His return from the dead had raised more questions than it answered. His memory was fragmented, ruptured by long stretches of nothingness and sudden surges of familiarity. He walked the streets of his old life like a stranger in a borrowed skin, acutely aware of how many pieces of himself were missing. But something in him had shifted a gnawing unrest that wouldn't let go. He found himself poring over reports at odd hours, tracing names and movements he couldn't remember learning. The pieces didn't fit, and yet they whispered. Something was wrong. He stumbled across an anomaly buried in WSB surveillance logs, a burst of encrypted radio traffic near Spoon Island, where no official missions had been logged. Then came the images, blurry infrared stills, showing movement in a section of Windermere long thought sealed off. Coupled with a string of confidential medical records connected to a non-existent patient, the evidence was circumstantial but undeniable. Someone was being kept there. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist. The trail was erratic, almost as if someone was laying it deliberately but too arrogantly to erase it entirely. Nathan followed it anyway, defying protocol and Sidwell's vague threats. The closer he got, the more he recognized a pattern, one that pointed not just to a prisoner, but to Anna. A tremor settled in his gut. The last time he saw Anna, she had looked invincible. To imagine her locked away, subjected to psychological warfare, left Nathan breathless. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became she hadn't walked away from her post. She had been taken. Every instinct in him roared to life, drowning out the bureaucratic fog that had smothered him since his return. He broke into Windermere under cover of darkness, navigating hallways thick with mildew and silence. And then, deep within the bowels of the estate, past a series of false walls and biometric locks, he found the chamber. The air was damp, the light dim, and there, barely a shell of the woman she once was, sat Anna, her eyes open but vacant, as if blinking through a fog that refused to lift. At first, she didn't recognize him. Her body flinched, as if preparing for another hallucination. Nathan approached slowly, not saying a word, only kneeling before her so she could see the truth in his face. There was a long pause, seconds stretched into lifetimes, and then her lips parted. Not in recognition, but in disbelief. The ghost she had conjured for weeks was suddenly breathing in front of her. and for a brief moment, Anna thought she had finally slipped into madness for good. Then the door slammed open. Nathan turned sharply, drawing his weapon instinctively. But what emerged wasn't a guard or a technician. It was Peter, fully alive, real, with eyes burning with the satisfaction of a man whose secrets were too heavy to be kept buried forever. And suddenly, Anna knew it hadn't been her mind betraying her. It had been the world. Peter spoke no words. There was no villainous monologue, only action. He lunged cold, efficient, precise. The struggle was brutal, wordless, primal. Anna could only watch, paralyzed by a cocktail of trauma and sedation. But Nathan fought with the fury of a man who had come back from the dead and refused to return. When it was over, Peter lay on the floor unmoving, blood blooming from beneath his body like a final curse. Nathan stood above him, breathing heavily, not in triumph but in horror. He hadn't just saved Anna, he had killed a phantom. And, in doing so, he had confirmed the impossible. The extraction was swift and silent. Nathan carried Anna out the same way he had come in, avoiding all detection. But the damage had been done not just to the woman he saved, but to the man he thought he was. Anna was alive, but shattered. Nathan was whole, but unraveling, and neither of them understood the scope of what had just happened. Because somewhere, in a different room, another camera flickered to life. Another figure watched through a grainy feed, taking notes, adjusting plans. Peter had been a decoy. Anna had been a test. And Nathan, the resurrected pawn, was only now stepping onto the real board. The game hadn't ended. It had only just begun. When Nathan forced his way into the underground holding cell, the air hung thick with damp decay and the heavy weight of broken time. The dim light from the hallway sliced across the room like a blade, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Anna sat motionless on the floor, her back against the far corner, her frame gaunt, her eyes vacant. The silence that met Nathan was chilling. A silence not of peace, but of disorientation and ruin. She didn't recognize him, not at first. To Anna, every sound, every movement had become a potential threat. Her mind, battered by sedatives and sensory deprivation, had twisted reality into something unstable. So when Nathan appeared in the doorway, silhouette, tall and unmoving, she recoiled in pure instinct. Heart hammering, breath caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. He took a cautious step forward, his voice still withheld, knowing that words would only fracture her further. It was not his name that broke through the haze for her, it was his eyes. There had been a time, in a life that now felt distant and foreign, when she had known those eyes better than anyone. In them, she found something achingly familiar, a silent promise of safety, of truth. That was what finally pierced through the layers of fear and confusion. Her breathing slowed, her trembling stilled, and as she blinked and focused, reality began to crystallize again. Nathan knelt beside her, offering the steadiness she hadn't felt in weeks, perhaps longer. He helped her to her feet slowly, gently, as though afraid that even the pressure of his hand might shatter her. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the nightmare might be over, like she might finally be leaving that hellish prison of her mind and body. But just as Nathan guided her toward the door, a loud, jarring slam reverberated through the chamber. The sharp crack of metal against metal was followed by a creeping silence, and then the sound of deliberate, measured footsteps approaching from behind. Nathan instinctively stepped in front of Anna, his stance protective, alert. And then the figure emerged from the shadows unmistakable, unflinching, and grotesquely familiar. It was Peter August, alive. Not just alive, but thriving on the shock that washed across their faces. The glint in his eyes was that of a man who had been watching, waiting, orchestrating. The hallucinations that had tormented Anna in her cell had not been madness. They had been memories, fragments of real encounters distorted by drugs and isolation. Peter had never died. He had simply retreated into the dark, biding his time, perfecting his father's legacy in silence while the world believed him gone. He spoke no words, made no justifications. He didn't need to. His presence was declaration enough that he had returned to complete the final phase of Caesar Faison's monstrous work. For Peter, Anna wasn't just a target. She was a symbol. Breaking her would mean breaking the last vestige of resistance his father never conquered. The fight that followed between Nathan and Peter was immediate and brutal. It wasn't a choreographed exchange of skill, it was war. Fists collided with bone, boots scraped against concrete, and every blow was laced with years of unfinished vengeance. Nathan fought not only for Anna's life, but for his own fractured identity for the stolen years. The haunting gaps in memory, the sense of being a weapon forged without consent. Peter, meanwhile, moved like a man with nothing to lose, drunk on his own delusion of superiority. But Nathan had been sharpened by something Peter underestimated: clarity. Not of memory, but of purpose. As the battle wore on, Nathan was cornered into a choice no soldier ever makes lightly: to let Peter live and risk the lives of everyone he might destroy, or end it here, permanently, even if it meant embracing the darkest parts of himself. In a single, chilling instant, Nathan made that decision. He struck with ruthless precision, and Peter crumpled to the ground in silence. His reign of terror ended not with fanfare, but with a thud. The silence that followed was not relief, it was reckoning. As Peter's lifeless body lay sprawled beneath the flickering light, Nathan stood over him, his chest heaving, but it wasn't victory that surged through him. It was memory. Long-suppressed fragments broke through Maxie's face the last time he saw her. The sound of his own voice, calling out in pain before darkness consumed him, and the realization that his resurrection had not been a miracle, but a manipulation. Someone had brought him back not out of mercy, but for a purpose he still couldn't fully comprehend. Killing Peter had severed one thread, but it had unraveled an entire tapestry of questions. Anna, though freed from her cell, was far from free. Her legs moved as Nathan supported her out of that room, but her mind remained trapped in the maze Peter had designed. The thought that she, once one of the most vigilant agents in the WSB, could be abducted, drugged, and psychologically broken without anyone noticing, tore at the very core of who she believed she was. It wasn't just betrayal by others that consumed her. It was betrayal by herself. Her pride had always been her armor, her precision, her instincts, her command. Now all of that felt like shattered glass at her feet. Even as she emerged into the cold night air, the stars above no longer looked the same. Every noise sounded like a threat, every flicker of light like a trap. She couldn't trust her own senses, her own mind. She questioned what had been real, what had been implanted. The line between hallucination and truth had been smeared beyond recognition. She had no compass now, only the echo of trauma and a man who had returned from the grave to save her. But somewhere deep inside, Anna knew this wasn't over. Not for her, not for Nathan, not for Port Charles. What she had endured was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something larger, something more organized. Peter had been a monster, but he had also been a servant. His death felt too easy, too final, too contained. Anna could sense it. She wasn't just a victim. She had been a test subject in a far more complex game, and the true puppeteer had yet to reveal their face. And Nathan, for all his heroism, had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had taken a life, not in battle, but in necessity. And with that act came the awakening of something deeper, something darker. The man who walked out of Windermere that night carrying Anna was not the same man who had entered. He had broken his own code. He had fulfilled a mission no one had asked him to undertake. And he, too, knew that the shadows they thought they escaped were only the surface of something far more terrifying, waiting underneath. The war had just begun, and both Anna and Nathan were already marked. Nathan, despite the triumph of defeating Peter, could not escape the shadow of uncertainty that now loomed larger than ever. The fight had left its physical scars, but it was the questions, silent and unrelenting, that began to claw at the corners of his mind. Why had he survived when he was meant to be dead and buried? Why did so many of his memories remain out of reach, locked behind some psychological wall that even he couldn't scale? And most troubling of all, why had he been drawn so precisely and instinctively to the exact location where Anna was being held? As if some invisible hand had been steering him through every step of this deadly maze. These weren't the kinds of questions born out of coincidence. They were clues, fragmented and chilling, pointing toward a truth he had yet to fully grasp. Something or someone had manipulated events with surgical precision. It wasn't just that Peter had survived, it was that Nathan had too. And he had been positioned perfectly to arrive just in time to stop Peter from finishing what Faison had started. The synchronicity was too sharp to ignore. It felt less like fate and more like a move on a chessboard designed by a grandmaster no one had yet seen. Peter, for all his cruelty, had never been the mastermind. He'd always been a son grasping at the legacy of a father he could never fully become. The real architects of destruction rarely show their faces, they watch from the rafters. pulling strings, tilting the game one calculated step at a time. Nathan knew this. Now, Peter was not the endgame. He was the final piece of an older strategy that had finally collapsed only to give way to something even more insidious. As Nathan and Anna quietly left the Windermere estate under cover of night, carrying the weight of trauma and unanswered questions with every step, they passed unaware beneath the eye of a hidden camera embedded in the damp, crumbling stone walls. A faint red light blinked to life the moment they exited. Its glow dim but steady, a signal that every movement had been observed, logged, and now relayed to an unknown source. The escape had been allowed. That much was clear. Miles away, in an undisclosed location cloaked in silence, a figure sat in a darkened room lit only by the pale blue flicker of multiple surveillance screens. The walls were lined with outdated monitors, patched with wires and static. But one screen remained crystal clear, the feed from the Windermere chamber. On the screen, Nathan and Anna were captured in grainy detail, exhausted, haunted, but alive. The figure leaned forward, elbows resting on a worn wooden desk, and tapped slowly, rhythmically, on its surface. The fingers moved with patience, not irritation, the kind of patience reserved for those who know exactly when and where their opponent will move next.